met before, but only briefly because my attention span at the time when I apologize for that. I would actually, I've heard very good things about you. I really have heard that. You are an MPP, right? And MPP second year? Yeah. You are the right person.
Are you here for the forum, sir?
No.
Have a seat. Те свършиха преди малко. Аз тук направих една много важна за нас връзка. Аз на всичко
Eat in the library. I just have a boatload of more. This is excellent.
It's so long. That's so long
Also
joke.
long.
David, how are you?
Hey,
What did you think of last night?
I love the fact that he's here.
Yeah, I wasn't as inspired.
He's not as impressive as Billy Graham.
I was like,
He's
I
not
went
as,
to lunch with Hutton the day before. He was saying he was gone. I felt like I had to be in.
he was no Billy Graham,
No,
but
but he has 80,000 members of his church, and he's doing something right.
doing something right. And I thought it was, I just thought it was extremely good.
No, I think it was great that he was here. I
He
I
got a
went home
respectful
reading his
hearing.
book, and I was like,
Is his book better?
well, I read like the first chapter, and the first few pages, they give you, they say it's a 40-day commitment and all that. I said, okay, I'm into, I'll try anything, right? And he, about the third page, it tells you how to buy what's the name of the book?
Another book.
No, how to buy like the Super Saver deck of cards that goes with it, so you don't have to write your mission of the day down. And it just turned me off, and I had to stop reading.
Well, thank you very much for being here. I'm Swanee Hunt. I direct the Women in Public Policy program. And this event this evening is sponsored by us and the Criminal Justice PIC and the Wiener Center's program on criminal justice and criminal justice policy and management. One of the biggest challenges that face women is the whole notion of mainstreaming, and particularly helping women move into non-traditional fields. And the women we have here today, our two guests, are real trailblazers in that sense, exemplifying women's strength to lead in many of the toughest environments. And so introducing them will be Ann Peel. Let me say a word about Ann. She is the Associate Professor of Public Policy here at the Kennedy School, and she studies the economics of crime and criminal justice policy. Her research has covered the behavior of prosecutors, the dynamics of youth violence, the effect of criminal justice policy on immigrants and vice versa, and the relationship between economic opportunity and criminal behavior. She's also interested in statistical methods and those that are used to evaluate social policies, and she's currently analyzing the determinants of criminal sentencing and studying the policies which govern the release of inmates from prisons and jails. Anne received her BA from Harvard, her PhD from Princeton, both in economics. We had a very interesting conversation in the side room here, talking among the four of us and others about the life experiences of our two guests. And I hope that you'll reflect on that in your remarks here, because I found that thinking about your trajectory in your career and the lessons that you learned along the way really helped me understand much better what might be possible in a better world. And I think that you two are very much going to be leading us toward that more enlightened future. So Anne, thank you very much for helping put this together.
Thank you, Swanee, for your leadership on this and other topics. I appreciate that. So I'm going to give a brief introduction here and then turn to our discussion. And I thought that I would introduce both Director Woodford and Commissioner Dennehy together, because their official Director Woodford and Commissioner Dennehy together, as their official bios reveal some commonalities. Both of our guests today began their professional lives in the correctional agencies which they now run, and both have spent the better part of 25 or 30 years or so working in a variety of capacities and working their way up the career ladders in their agencies. In Director Woodford's case, she began as a correctional officer in San Quentin, and it seems held nearly every position in that facility before being elevated to warden in 1999, I believe. There's a nice story last year in the New York Times Magazine that talks about her leadership as warden in San Quentin and how that was different than those who'd run the facility before her. Her background is in as a correctional officer and working as a legal affairs coordinator, and also several stints in central administration, working on a variety of management topics. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in criminal justice from Sonoma State University. Commissioner Dennehy, in her tenure with the Massachusetts Department of Correction, has worked at a number of the facilities in the state, and also in a variety of management positions in personnel training, health services, and classification. When she was named commissioner for Massachusetts, she was functioning as associate or deputy commissioner at the time. She holds a master's degree in public administration from Suffolk University and a bachelor's degree from Wheaton College. Interestingly, both women have been in their respective jobs for almost exactly 1 year. So it's an interesting time to check in with them about where they see their agencies, where they've come from, and their prospects for where they're going. And they both were named to their positions by Republican governors who had campaigned as reformers. So I'm very interested to hear about their experiences in those similar kinds of settings. But there are also differences in their agencies. Director Woodford runs an agency with 50,000 staff, responsible for 300,000 offenders, about half of whom are incarcerated and the other half, approximately, are on parole. Her budget is $6 billion per year, which the website indicates is just 6% of the California General Fund. The Massachusetts Department of Correction is much smaller, 5,000 staff, with 10,000 incarcerated offenders and no responsibility for oversight of parolees. The budget in Massachusetts is about $1.5 billion per year, and is a smaller percentage of state because of the smaller responsibilities, including the fact that some offenders with shorter sentences in Massachusetts are overseen by county jails. So with that as brief background, I'd like to turn to our panel. And I'll start with kind of an open question that would allow you to respond to Swani's challenge to you, to reflect on your own experience. As leaders who've devoted your professional lives to corrections, how have the primary professional challenges evolved over your careers? And what is the central challenge facing you in your work right now? Director Woodford?
Well, I think when I started in 1978, the real challenge then was having women in corrections, period. When I started at San Quentin State Prison, they were just allowing women to work inside the facility. And when you started there, I went straight from college right into working inside the prison during the most violent time in the history of the California Department of Corrections. There was violence against staff, and there were inmate violence against other inmates. So it was really addressing or trying to understand the role I could play in such a violent environment. Then as I promoted up through the ranks, with every new position came the challenge of proving that women could do the job and do it differently than men and still be effective. And so being there for the 26 years that I was, I found myself in positions that I was able to bring in volunteers, begin programs, treat offenders in a very different sort of way. And what I mean by that is if you walk into San Quentin State Prison, people will notice this today, if you go in there, offenders will speak to you and ask you how you are, and they'll shake your hand. You walk into and that's a very social environment. When you walk into other prisons in the state, you don't find that. And I really didn't realize that until I became director and started going into other prisons around the state. So the challenge for me was to create a very social environment where we could bring in the public to help us address the issues within that prison. And my challenge now, of course, is to bring that to other prisons around the state of California. In addition to that, as was mentioned, Governor Schwarzenegger appointed me to this position, and he's very committed to reform in the California Department of Corrections. So based on his initiatives and his goals, as he is fond of saying, corrections ought to correct. So we have a strategic plan that makes rehabilitation our primary mission. And we're going through the process of identifying the changes that need to occur in our organization to make that a reality. And going through a strategic plan is a very lengthy process that requires bringing everybody to the table so that we all understand where we're trying to get to, and we make very sound decisions about how we're going to get there. So that's my biggest challenge now, is implementing that plan.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Dennehy?
For me, I started as, if you will, a student intern in 1974. I went from a very small women's college to the state prison for men. Quite a transition. And I did it for a summer job, actually working for the Department of Mental Health. I thought I would just do it for a summer and go back to school, and that would be that. I found the work fascinating. I found the environment fascinating. And when I graduated, I was invited back to Walpole as a records manager, which really gave me an opportunity to handle all of the legal paperwork and to start to learn the art of computing inmates' dates. The inmates used to refer to me as the good time lady because, of course, I was very popular on the grounds because I was the one who could tell inmates when they were going home. I was the one who understood how to compute their dates. When I look back at the challenges, frankly, I didn't fully appreciate it when I first started, how few women worked in the agency. I don't think I fully comprehended that until I started to transfer through the agency in the late 70s. And then I realized that the U.S. Department of Justice was in fact suing the Massachusetts Department of Correction for its lack of representation of women. But for that lawsuit, I probably would not have advanced to some of the positions that I did. That certainly heightened the sensitivity of the department around the ongoing discrimination against women. Professionally, another thing that sticks out in my mind was how tremendously overcrowded the Massachusetts prison system was in the late 70s and 80s. When I worked at Concord, it was the routine that those of us who had offices, we would have to empty out our desks at night, take our personal belongings out of our offices because mats and cots would be rolled in at night to accommodate the terrific overflow of the inmate population. So when I think about the challenges of the early years, I think about the sheer numbers of inmates, the violence that can breed, the slow movement throughout the system of offenders because of the lack of beds. And I also think about the professional challenges around the lack of opportunities for women. To fast forward to today, the single biggest challenge that I face has to do with the culture, has to do with the very nature of prisons. And I caution folks when we talk about culture, it's not as simple as saying there's one prison culture. There are a variety of cultures. Each, as you were saying, each institution has a different feel. But I think it's more than that. Within each institution, each shift has a different feel. There's a decided difference between the 7 to 3 shift and the 3 to 11 shift, or between those that work in healthcare and those that perhaps work in housing units. So it's not a very, very simple issue, but that's my biggest challenge today.
Okay, interesting. Now, Commissioner Dennehy, in preparing for this forum, I asked you what difference gender makes in your job, and you responded, the names that they call you. Okay. You can either respond and explicate what you were thinking about when you said that, or alternatively, you could provide us some insight into the role of gender based on the research literature.
Well, in that both of my parents are still living, they're 84 and they're native Cantabrigians, I won't use the words. But I would say that particularly in dealings with, and I want to be very clear, not so much the inmate population, but certainly in the labor management forum. And I want to be doubly clear that it is not necessarily reflective of the workforce, but some particular union leaders, frankly, use words to describe a female administrator that would not be used to describe a male administrator. That was the first difference I noticed.
Is there any literature on careers of women in corrections that we can learn something from in addition to your own experiences?
Actually, I know that the American Correctional Association and the National Institute of Corrections years ago did some research around women who work in corrections and women who make it to the top. And they found some patterns that are pretty consistent, that for the most part, women, not surprisingly, tend to drive further to their place of employment. And I think that can be understood to mean that where the job opportunity is, women drive. If it's a 2-hour ride, they do the extra distance, they go the extra distance. So the research suggested that women, in fact, as they went up the promotional ladder, incurred these longer commutes. And secondly, this phenomenon of women cutting across divisions, not, and I think the research is probably a little bit different than your experience, Jean. I know in Massachusetts, when I look at the 4 or 5 women who have made it to the level of what you would call warden, most of them have worked in a variety of institutions, have cut across the disciplines within the organization chart, where the men in the system who have promoted have tended to have a more traditional hierarchical ascent up one silo in the organization.
Do you have any comments on this topic?
Well, as you said, my experience is different, and I think that I'm very fortunate that my experience was different. Starting at San Quentin State Prison in 1978, when it was such a violent place, and being able to make it there and promote and have successes, I think really earned me the respect of the correctional officers that work at that prison. And because it's San Quentin, one of the most famous prisons in the state of California, I received a lot of media attention, so I became known throughout the state. So when I became director, I have to say that I received a lot of support. Now in the early days that wasn't true, and that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and surviving those many first years at San Quentin were really tough, and I don't want to minimize that. It was very tough for all the women who worked there. But having done so, I think has made my job today easier. I don't hear people having concerns that I'm the director and that I'm a female director, not at all. And so I'm really pleased about that.
I wonder if you could speak about female offenders a little bit. Women in the criminal justice system are often an afterthought in discussions on corrections and when it becomes to policy, because men are so much more numerous in the systems. but all indicators that you look at show that the average woman in prison appears very different from the average man. So I guess I'll start with you, Director Woodford. If you were designing a criminal justice system for women alone, how would it look? And does that give us any insight into how we think about corrections more generally?
Well, the good news is that I am designing a criminal justice system for women, and we've already started that process. When I was a correctional officer at San Quentin State Prison, I was interviewed by a woman who was receiving her doctorate at Berkeley, and she was studying correctional officers. Later on, she became one of the leading experts in female offenders in the United States, and she continued to be my friend. So when I became director, she was at my door saying, "What are you going to do about female offenders?" Well, I had never worked with female offenders. And so I went out to look at our prisons, our female prisons. And what I saw when I went there is that we have treated them as if they're male offenders. We've used this one-size-fits-all. We have the same amount of security when you don't need the same amount of security. We have the same type of staff when you don't need the same type of staff. What we need in our female prisons is a very different kind of staffing pattern, more social workers. Female offenders don't require the kind of security that we provide. And so we're going to be starting right at base with a forum of women, including college professors, 3 who have agreed to come to the table and help us with this, 3 national experts on female offenders. We're using the National Institute of Corrections gender responsive study as our guide as to what we should be doing within our female prisons. We've made the decision, for example, to stop cross-gender searches on female inmates. Now we have to take the steps to get us there, which is bargaining with the union, recruiting more female staff to work in our female prisons, doing those steps that we need to take to get to that point where we can stop those cross-gender searches. We're going to relook at our classification system. I think in the next 18 to 24 months, we're going to be doing some very exciting things in the state of California with female offenders. And I'm really proud to say that.
Mm-hmm. Now, Massachusetts has a long tradition of treating women offenders somewhat differently, right? Can you comment on that?
Yes, actually, Massachusetts has the oldest continually operating state prison for women in the entire country. We have to give credit to Indiana for building the first separate facility for women, but it burnt down. So Massachusetts was very quick to step forward and say, yes, but ours is the oldest continually operating prison for women. But it all goes back to the late 1800s, and there was a significant reformatory movement led by women. When you think about what was going on in the late 1800s, women were talking about getting the right to vote. Women were just starting to emerge from their homes, and women were they were activists. They were concerned about the social issues of the day, and many women came together and in a variety of northeastern states prevailed upon their governors to build prisons led by women for women. And I'm often struck by how there really is very little new in corrections. If you ever have the opportunity to go back and look at some of the old headlines, the newspapers from that time period, the women in Massachusetts had previously been held in a jail, Greenfield. And lo and behold, a female offender became impregnated by a correction officer while she was in segregation. That started the cry for a separate facility for women. And a statute was passed creating the facility at Framingham, and it was a very unique facility architecturally. It was a large main corridor with several, what they referred to as divisions, separate corridors. It was a rather crude first attempt at inmate classification by putting youthful offenders in one designated area, alcoholics in another designated area. And my favorite crime of the time was stubbornness. It was something that only women could do. And looking at the old records, they did it in great numbers. But again, I think prisons reflect back society. And when you look at the crimes that women served at that period of time, it very much made sense the way the prison was organized. Even back then, there was sensitivity to having appropriate program space, to having appropriate health care space. At the time, the facility actually had a nursery. And there was dedicated space for a prison nursery. So as you look at that old facility that still stands, there was some very thoughtful planning around the differences for that physical plant as opposed to the traditional male facility up at Concord, which was built under the same act and the same appropriation, to very different environments.
Over time, did they come to be treated more similarly, or have they continued to operate somewhat differentially
They
within the
operated
system?
very, very differently. And again, for those of you who are from Massachusetts, I stumbled across this at the Schlesinger Library. There was a woman by the name of Miriam Van Waters who was very nationally well known as a reformer in the area of female offenders. She was the warden at Framingham for many, many years, had been recruited as a judge from California, and she did really progressive things. She introduced work release and the use of substance abuse programs and education. She was very forward-thinking. Those initiatives weren't taking place in the male facilities. She ran into some political problems, and with the new election of a new governor, her then commissioner decided to fire her. And there was a little-known clause in her contract which allowed her to invoke a public hearing, which she did in Gardner Auditorium. And that, I know that the transcripts of that trial exist because she left her papers to Harvard. But it's a fascinating study about the backlash against a woman doing reform work in prison. And the long and short of it is she was fired. It helped that she had a close friend in Eleanor Roosevelt who came to her aid, and there was a huge hue and cry, and the governor did as the only option he really had politically was he reconvened another group to take a look at the determination to terminate her. And the long and short of it is she was reinstated as the superintendent at Framingham. But there are several women in Massachusetts history who have really distinguished themselves internationally as reformers. So Framingham had a very, very different feel. It had a newspaper published every day. It was rich around the use of theater and gardening, which was not at all what was happening with the male offenders back then.
I'm struck by your comment that all the issues that we're dealing with today, are exactly the same and kind of in the same relief as you read history. But nonetheless, we will address some of those, continue to. Inmate reentry is something we hear a great deal about these days, and I want to know from your perspective, what is the right role of corrections in thinking about inmate reentry, and what can we really hope for from improvements in this area, in this current environment? Director Woodford?
Well, corrections has to be responsible for providing the kind of programs offenders need to prepare them for reentry. I mean, that is our role. And when you talk about rehabilitation, you need to begin preparing that inmate for parole from the moment they arrive at a prison. One of the pilot programs that I started at San Quentin, which we were trying to take statewide, was the concept of building a community within the prison. And at San Quentin, we had what we called the Success Dorm. And in that dorm, and all the inmates that lived in there agreed to certain rules. They agreed to the rules that they developed within the rules of the Department of Corrections. They agreed to participate in 3 self-help groups a week. All of that was by volunteers because we had no money to provide program. And they agreed to do journaling, and they also agreed to write their own parole plan, because up to then, inmates were leaving the prison without any plan whatsoever. So on a larger scale, what we've done at the Department of Corrections is we received enough funding where our parole agents start to work with our offenders now at 210 days before they get out to start to develop a parole plan. So when they leave there, they know where they're going to sleep their first night out. They know what their plan is going to be. Because when you let offenders out the gate of your prison without knowing where they're going to stay, you end up with offenders saying things to you like, I'm going to stay at my mom's house. Well, when you call mom, mom says, oh, no, he's not. So when you start working with them months ahead and they give you those kinds of answers, then you're able to say, well, let's call mom and see if mom really wants you to stay there. And then you get them to realize what the reality is. Maybe they have burned all those bridges. Maybe what we're looking for now is for you to stay at a shelter but we prepare and the offender knows where they're going to go when they leave the gates of a prison. We know that the longer you keep an offender in their community, the better they're going to do. So we've changed our parole initiatives to include things like, for technical violations, you're not sent back to prison. You're sent maybe to a halfway house. We call it the Halfway Back program. We've extended our use of electronic monitoring to keep you at home. We're really beginning to try to identify substance abuse resources in the community where our offenders return to. We've also had 2 large community outreach days where we've had 300 to 400 people show up from the various communities around the state of California. And we're inviting them in because what I say to people is, I have 160,000 plus people locked up in our prisons and another 114,000 on parole. If you're asking me to put my arms around that problem, it's impossible. This problem belongs to all of us. So communities, you need to come and help. 90% of my offenders are going to return to your communities. And you need to be at the table helping us figure out how we're going to appropriately and safely re-enter them back to your communities. And with the whole concept of is that the doors of a prison swing both ways. And we need to prepare our offenders inside the prison, prepare our communities for their reentry in a safe way, and have our offenders leave our prisons with a realistic reentry plan. So we're going to live up to our responsibilities, Department of Corrections, and we're asking the communities to live up to their responsibility, and we're asking our offenders to do the same. In the past, what we rewarded our offenders for was for being compliant. What we're trying to reward our offenders for now is for change. So, for example, in our parole initiatives, one of the things that we're working with some professors from the University of California, Irvine on is to identify the milestones that we should expect offenders to achieve. And for example, when they're out on parole, if we say to the offender, if you get your GED, we're going to let you off parole sooner. We're going to do that if that's a safe thing to do. So we're working with some college professors to develop that model. And it's incentivizing the progress of offenders changing is what we're planning on doing in the state of California.
One dramatic difference between your 2 jurisdictions is that not only do you oversee parole, but I think nearly all of your inmates are supervised following release, right?
All offenders leave
All
with parole.
offenders, right, on some kind of parole. Now, neither of those are true for you. So how does inmate reentry function differently under those circumstances?
Well, in Massachusetts, we started to notice along about 97, 98, and this was very much a reaction to truth in sentencing. We started to see that offenders were serving significantly longer periods of time at higher levels of custody, meaning folks were at medium and maximum level of custody. And the second major difference was they were waiving their right to see the parole board. I shouldn't say their right, their privilege to see the parole board. But they were making a conscious decision to not look at parole as an option, which inmates will tell you is a little bit of investment planning. You do a little bit more time, and then when the individual is released, you answer to no one. You're on no supervision. And inmates like that, sadly, because the stats are really clear that offenders who are on parole supervision or probation supervision recidivate at a higher rate. It seems counterintuitive, but it makes sense. They're the folks who are being watched. So inmates would prefer to discharge in the aggregate and sort of go out under the radar. That's a public policy prescription for disaster, to have offenders going out at higher level of custody, not prepared for the transition, and going out with no support and no supervision. So unlike Jeannie's system, we are not an integrated system. Parole, probation, and corrections are separate. I can really only speak to the last year, and it's been a privilege to work with Maureen Walsh, who's the chairperson for the Massachusetts Parole Board. As much as we are 2 distinct agencies, I think by virtue of our personalities and our value systems, we've been able to work together. And the Department of Corrections set aside a $9 million grant that we had received through the feds under what's termed VOIDUS, the Violent Offender Truth in Sentencing Grant. We planned on using that money originally to refurbish 64 beds. 64 beds. We're not terribly overcrowded. We didn't need, the last thing we needed to do was more prison construction. We took that money and requested of the feds the permission to use it jointly. So we sat down and tried to identify where the real gaps in our system were. Where could we make measurable improvement in terms of increasing the parole rates of those that are appropriate, eligible, and suitable, and where we could also increase the movement of the appropriate and eligible inmates through the system to lower custody. So we've just begun that work. We were very happy just last week to be notified that we've been awarded that money. Some of that money is going to allow us to greatly increase our substance abuse in-house programming, as well as our education programs and our voc-ed program at the minimum custody level. So we were thrilled to be able to have that flexibility with the grant money. But in general terms, I think reentry challenges all of us who work in criminal justice to work together in different ways. Folks who work in criminal justice, it's easy for us to set up the boundaries and the turf battles and not work collaboratively. Reentry cannot be done effectively unless those barriers are taken down and there are different styles of work and agreement and collaboration between agencies. Reducing recidivism, successful reentry is not the sole mission of one single agency. And we have other sister agencies and partners that need to come to the table. And in Massachusetts, I'm happy to say, particularly the Department of Public Health and the Department of Mental Health, most recently have invited the Department of Corrections to be at the table for their strategic plans, because they realize that we often are the front door to treatment. We are not the back door to treatment. We can be the front door to treatment for some of those issues. So it's an exciting time to be in corrections. We had mentioned this earlier in our discussion in the side room, that to have a president talk about reentry and to have federal money trickling down to the states to address prisoner reentry, it's really quite remarkable to see this in a relatively short period of time.
And if I could also add that when we've looked at our offenders, we've tried to identify the challenges that they face. And when we have paid attention to an issue, we've made a difference. For example, with our mentally ill offenders, for about 3 or 4 years, we really targeted finding resources for them when they return to communities. And as a result, the recidivism rate among that group has just continued to drop. And it just showed the state of California that when you pay attention and you have a really strong plan for people to return to a community that addresses their health issues, where they're going to live, who is going to be there to provide support for them, that it really does work. We experienced similar success with our female offenders. When we paid attention to their reentry to the community and reuniting them with their children and their family, we saw the recidivism rate among female offenders begin to drop as well. So we're trying to take those lessons and find the right kind of program for the right kind of offender to return them back to where they're going to live their lives.
Director Woodford, I want to push you a little bit on the parole violations issue. Been in your position for a year, and you've been on the stage for half an hour, so I'm going to try to push back a little bit harder. I appreciate what you were saying about halfway back programs and thinking about different ways of responding to parole violations short of returning somebody to a long sentence in prison. But if I've read your statistical tables correctly, I believe that 60,000 of your current inmates are serving time on sentences due to parole violations, and I'm wondering how you can reconcile those views for us and how we should be thinking about those numbers.
Well, we've actually been as high as 70,000 offenders returning annually for parole violations. And those numbers are, we actually projected that our numbers would decrease greater than they have, but they are coming down. And they're coming down because we are using some of the programs like the halfway back. Now, when we received the funding for these programs, we thought we could get these programs up and running much quicker than we have been able to. But when you start negotiating contract for beds in communities, you run into problems getting those beds in the communities. When you start negotiating contracts for services, you end up with service providers, grieving, contract awards, so you have to get through all those legal processes. I will tell you one of the things that I learned coming from San Quentin up to Sacramento, overseeing this huge department, is the kind of bureaucracy that you have to face to roll out new programs. So unfortunately, our initiatives have taken longer than we have thought to get out there. The good news is where many of our programs that are up and running have shown a reduction in recidivism. We have also learned what programs aren't working very well. For example, we had what we called a SAC2 program, which consisted of a 30 days of dry out with some follow-up. We're not getting the kind of results from that program that we thought we would. The programs for drug treatment that are working, we have 9,000 drug treatment beds where inmates receive extensive drug treatment inside the prison system and then extensive follow-up when they parole. Now that's showing to be the best in the nation. So some of the initiatives, we're learning what isn't working, and we're not going to try to defend that. We're going to throw away what isn't working and stick with those programs that are, and try some new innovative programs within the state as resources are available, and expand those that show results.
I want to turn a little bit to politics. And in both Massachusetts and in California, we hear a great deal about the power of correctional unions, particularly involved in sort of gubernatorial or other statewide elections. And I'm hoping that you could speak to the public perception of that power. Is that legitimate, or are we just over-perceiving something? What it actually means for politics, and also what does it mean for the operations of your correctional systems? So I was wondering if you might start, Commissioner Dennehy. Sure. I know that your largest correctional union has issued, again, I think, the call for the governor to remove you from your position, and I think that relates to this issue of what is the power, the political power base of the correctional union.
Yes, that was the second time in 1 week that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm 2 for 2. I think, well, first and foremost, I have to say that having spent so much time in corrections, number one, I've belonged to unions along the way, and I very much appreciate that unions have a role to play. And I'm very proud that I'm a card-carrying member of the Mass Teachers Association. So I have no issues with unions. I do think that there are ways in which contracts can very much impact operations. And Massachusetts being such an old state, for anyone who has spent time in the area of labor management and personnel, you have to have a healthy respect for past practice when you're dealing with union contracts. And for so long in Massachusetts, each warden, each superintendent reported separately to through their hierarchical chain of command, which meant that each institution has a pretty different way of operating when it comes to what we refer to as job pick, when it comes to job swaps. And these are all sort of terms of art that are used in corrections, but it basically means that management does not necessarily have control over where individuals work within an institution. So for example, we run 11 therapeutic communities within our walled facilities. These are communities, they're housing units that are dedicated to treatment, essentially addressing substance abuse and with a heavy focus on relapse prevention. It makes sense in that milieu to have folks who can work well. That's not a job or a position that comes easily to everyone. In our system, we cannot necessarily choose which staff would work in that unit. And for anyone who's worked in an environment like that, all it takes is one toxic employee or one toxic resident in a therapeutic milieu to upset the whole progress on the unit. So it would be helpful to have more flexibility as a manager in terms of where those placements could be made. And in Massachusetts, Governor Romney, after a very high-profile death of a former priest, John Gagan, established the Governor's Commission on Correctional Reform. And I know that that report is available online, so I won't go through it in tremendous detail. But as it relates to the unions, there's a lively discussion around the benefits, the cost of the benefits, And in addition, the amount of sick time that's used, the average individual who works in the Department of Correction in uniform takes about 17 to 18 sick days a year. Now, I know when I worked at Old Colony about 10 years ago, when I was in charge of personnel, the average employee used 3 days. So you can see the exponential growth. With that comes a considerable price tag for overtime. It's really not any different than the phenomenon that's going on in the Boston Police Department, that's going on in the Boston Fire Department. Both of those stories have been covered in local papers. When you have a budget that 73 to 75% of it is fixed on personnel costs, right then and there, when you have to sustain any type of a budget cut or readjustment, that represents the biggest portion of the pie. And in Massachusetts, we're creeping up to about 16% of our budget on health care, which is very high end compared to most states throughout the country. And
that's on inmate health care?
Inmate health care. It tends to average 10 to 12%. We're very high end. There are reasons for that. But my point is, by the time you add up health care, add up the costs for the workforce, we still have to feed, we still have to do linen, and it is New England. Utility costs are considerable, and we have 18 facilities. That doesn't leave us with a tremendous amount of discretionary funds. So the best bet for redirecting money to programs that truly do change behavior and reduce recidivism is to contain the costs of sick time abuse and industrial accidents. And those are issues that, frankly, when we have labor management discussions, that's when we feel each other's elbows.
Mm-hmm. Could you give us a little insight into the environment in California? Around here, we tend to hear about it in election years, but I'm sure it has influence in between as well.
We have some of the same problems that you talked about, sick leave and post and bid and those issues that have been given away in prior administrations. But the position of our governor, and he's been very strong about this, and so it's been very helpful to me and to our agency secretary, is that the union has the right to talk to us about wages, hours, and working condition, but not be involved in policy. And prior administrations allowed all of the bargaining units in California to be involved in policy making, and that, unfortunately, had an impact on the Department of Corrections. When you look at the Department of Corrections, we deal with 17 different bargaining units. So when each of those bargaining units has a say in policy, then what management wants to accomplish or what your administration wants to accomplish is very, very difficult. But the good news is Governor Schwarzenegger is very committed to keeping the union focused on wages, hours, and working condition. He says that we will set policy, and he will set policy, and the Department of Corrections is going to reform itself. We have addressed issues like code of silence. We've done extensive training with our staff, come out with a very strong policy. We have totally revamped our employee disciplinary process with a matrix assessment of penalty for specific acts. So, for example, if you have been found to have lied, you will be fired, and that penalty is known beforehand. So if there's a finding that you did that, there's no question about that, and that's consistent. We've also added an Inspector General's office who has oversight over our entire disciplinary process. We've brought transparency to the Department of Corrections. All of the actions taken against staff are public record, and the Inspector General puts that up on their website. We are audited by the Inspector General so that they can come into our prisons and look at whether we are addressing things like the code of silence. Not only are we raising the expectations for how our inmates will behave, we're raising the expectations for how each and every one of our staff members will behave within our prison system. I think it's just a wonderful, exciting time to be in the state of California, because when you bring reform to the prison system and you bring reform to your employees and how they will behave, you need both of those to come together to make it happen.
Well, I want to thank you both for responding so considerately to my questions, and I want to open it up for questions from the audience. So I think we have 2 microphones here, and I think everybody knows there are 2 rules. You have to identify yourself and you have to ask a question.
Those are two.
My name is Josh. I'm a sophomore at Harvard College, and I'm a native Californian. So I have a question for Director Woodford, though luckily I don't have any personal experience with the California Department of Corrections. But I do know that there are quite a few people in the California Department of Corrections, both in terms of sheer numbers and per capita. I think we're one of the higher per capita incarceration states. And there was an article in The Economist last week, I don't know if you saw it, about that. And so my question for you is, are there too many people in the California prison system? If so, why? And if not, why does California need to incarcerate such a large percentage of its population relative to other states?
Well, in the state of California, there has been just a get tough on crime policy that has gone on for a long time, and the purpose of prisons was to punish. Fortunately, under our new mission statement, the purpose of prison is to rehabilitate. And I think that the prior policy has shown itself to be ineffective, and it actually has made the public less safe. When you look at the United States, there's 13 million ex-offenders out in the public sector. When you look at a state like California and you see the number of people that we have locked up, when I started in 1978, I think we had about 26,000 people incarcerated. And now we were as high as 165,000. We are now down to 161,500. But when you see the impact of that and you think of the ripple effect, when you look at statistics like 80% of our female offenders are mothers, 50% of our male offenders are fathers, 60% of their children will end up having problems in school, difficulty with the law, and probably incarcerated, then you understand this problem is going to get bigger. And incarcerating people is just not the right answer for many of these issues. So I think the stage is being set to look at this whole issue differently. I think it is really about identifying those evidence-based programs that we can bring in and show the public that if we do these 3 things or 5 things, you will be safer. Then I think that we can get the public to understand that we need to approach this in a very different sort of way. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Anna Wong. I'm an MPA 2 student here at Kennedy School. This is actually a good follow-up to that question. I was wondering, you mentioned the sort of town halls for engaging the community in reentry initiatives, and I'm wondering what the response, what did they suggest, and what was their response to working with the DOC?
For many of the people who came to our forums, they said, you've been hard to help. We've been knocking at the door for a very long time. You just wouldn't let us in. So, and San Quentin was the exception because the last year I was there, we had 3,000 volunteers come into that prison. So for those areas where we've been hard to help, our agency secretary, Mr. Hickman, is going to have an Office of Community Outreach so that we can figure out how to be easier to help and allow those volunteers to come inside our prison and help us with the many, many issues that the state of California can't afford to address on its own. That's one initiative. The other is that for some areas the major areas where our offenders parole to, they've said, you have ignored us. For example, I went to the city of Watts, and I'll tell you, I gained so much respect. I drove up there without any security. I had my ombudsman with me, and we went in and we sat down and talked to a group of ex-offenders and ex-gang members. And I said, okay, tell me what we did right and tell me what we did wrong. And they were very candid and honest with me about the things within the prison system that they thought we did well. And they identified those areas where we failed miserably. And for the one offender who had been there, he went in at age 19, came out at 29, had been out 2 weeks. And he said, what you taught me inside the prison system that I didn't learn out here in this community is that you taught me structure. And then you sent me out here with no structure whatsoever. I didn't know where I was going to stay. I didn't know how I was going to get from the bus station to anywhere that was safe. And if it hadn't been for this little group of guys in Watts who are trying to make a difference, I would have been out there on my own. So we need to make a better connection between what our offenders and their return back out to these communities. When you look at an area like Watts, they said to me, do you know that you parole 100 people a week here in an area that has 50% unemployment rate? What is it that you expect will happen? They're right about that. So we got busy sending some of our staff out to begin a program there We identified that in the LA area, there's a great need for construction trades. So we're working in the city of Watts to develop a program in connection with the unions to teach those job skills so that we can get them back to work. So it's really understanding the entire issues surrounding the offender, the issues of the community where we're sending them to, and working with that community to come up with answers. And it isn't going to be easy, but I think we're heading in the right direction.
Hi, my name is Bo Kilmer, and I'm a PhD candidate here at the Kennedy School. Both of you seem to be committed to implementing new evidence-based programs and rehabilitating offenders, and I really appreciate that. But given that we still have so much to learn about recidivism and reentry, I wonder if you would support an experiment where non-violent offenders would be randomly assigned to 3 different conditions: no parole obligations, regular parole, and then the best type of parole service you can provide, and then track them for 3-4 years, not just based on recidivism, but kind of tracking their social interactions and all the other factors that public health would care about. Would you support that?
I'll take it.
Okay, go ahead. Then I'll answer it
I'll
next.
take it because I don't have parole. So I can breathe. But I'm going to give you sort of a theoretical response. I think it is absolutely critical in systems like Massachusetts, where we are not an integrated system, that at the point the offender comes into the system, there needs to be some mutual discussion and understanding up front at the point of commitment around this particular individual, in terms of what is their risk, at what point, depending upon the type of sentence that exists in Massachusetts. For some sentences, there's tremendously more discretion in terms of when the parole could take place. For others, obviously, there aren't. But to the extent that there is discretion, I think it should be driven by risk assessment. It should be driven by behavior. And that's not something that we traditionally have done jointly. The grant that I mentioned earlier, one of the things that the Sex Offender Registry Board and the Department of Correction and Parole have been very interested in doing is working together to do some of that sorting at the front end. And for those that stay in the system, continue to work around what that risk reduction plan should look like in a very planned, organized, sequential way that respects the resources that are available and requires the linkages at the back end of the system. I think the other issue that really critically needs to be looked at is at the point of release, whether it's earlier or later, having graduated degrees of supervision on parole. One size doesn't fit all. For those that are at low risk to recidivate, it would seem to me that they'd be most appropriate for a bracelet or whatever, saving the resources for those tougher, higher risk to recidivate. And the research is certainly there to give us a leg up on how to structure those types of programs.
How about California?
For California, what I support is just responsible policy based on evidence. And so we too are looking at a risk and needs assessment, and we're working with Joan Pedersilli at the University of California, Irvine, who's probably the best known reentry researcher there is, to identify an appropriate risk and needs assessment tool. And based on that, I'm not totally in favor of ending parole, but what I am in favor of is saying that if you achieve the following things, then we will let you off parole. When I came into this job, what I discovered was that if you did everything we asked you to do, we didn't let you off parole. If you didn't do everything we asked you to do, we still didn't let you off parole. I mean, there was no win, so there was no incentive. So immediately what we did is the penal code allows us to let people off parole at 13 months if they have not had any infractions with the law. So we immediately began to institute what the law says. But we want to expand it beyond that and say to an offender, do these 3 things that the evidence shows works and we'll let you off parole. And that's what we're trying to do in California. And I think that's a responsible approach. And we really are trying to make sure that we respect everybody that's involved in this issue. We've talked to victims groups, we've talked to communities where our offenders return to. We're trying to address everyone's concern, and generally people support what I just discussed. So I think that's a good place to begin.
Yeah, no, it is. It seems like, especially with this new grant in Massachusetts, for those low-level offenders, I mean, you could just randomly assign some people to having the bracelet and some people not having the bracelet and just see what happens. It seems like if you're focused on evidence-based programs, that would be useful. See if it
You know,
works.
I would call your attention to the, you probably are already aware of the National Institute of Corrections website. Apt Associates here in Cambridge had secured the contract for NIC to develop the national model for the transition from prison into the community. So there's quite a bit of local material that's available.
Thanks.
My name is Jesse Janetta. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School. I have a question about accountability for corrections institutions. Here at the Kennedy School, we talk a lot about creating public value. And I'm wondering how we as citizens should judge our corrections institutions as far as whether they are delivering public value to society.
Say it's a really scary question to people who work in corrections. I know from I use the term at least 3 times a week because we are geographically dispersed. Our command staff speaks on the phone every morning, and we refer to it as a PAC call. And the focus is on performance, accountability, and culture. We try to limit the discussion to those 3 target areas. What are we doing about raising performance standards either in the aggregate or at the individual level? What are we doing about holding folks accountable? And what are we seeing in measurable ways around the culture? It's very threatening to people in corrections to say, let's judge our performance by reducing recidivism. But I think that ultimately reducing recidivism is the answer to that question. Saying that, it's, what's that old expression, liars figure and figures lie? You have to be very cautious about recidivism data in terms of how states structure them. I think I've done consulting now in 30-something states, and I'm always a little bit leery when I see aggregate data that talks about recidivism within a 30-day period. Because the reality is an offender couldn't get out, commit a crime, and be recommitted within 30 days. So if you're using a 30-day window for recidivism, you're probably going to have very good recidivism stats. The norm is pretty much 3 years. I think 3 years is a fair assessment. It takes time to get inmates through the programs that would make those differences, building that infrastructure so that you have 3 years out to review. But I think ultimately it's recidivism.
I agree that it's recidivism, but I think we have to set the stage for that. And in the state of California, as I talked about earlier, it's been a one-size-fits-all. It's been one correctional policy no matter what kind of offender. So in part of my reorganization, we're going to mission-base oversight of the prisons. So for example, there'll be a deputy director over female prisons. There'll be a deputy director over our minimum medium custody inmates, over our higher in medium close custody inmates, and then over our high security inmates. And by doing that, I think we'll be able to set a bar that people should meet for each of those different kinds of offenders. Because for female offenders, your recidivism rate, you should be able to be more successful because there's statistics that show that women adapt to programs much easier than the men do. For your lower end offenders, your minimum medium custody inmates, there should be a greater success rate. As you get to the higher end offender, it gets to be a little tougher. So once we get organized under these mission-based supervision, set the standards for each of those prisons, begin to monitor that the prisons are meeting those standards, then we will then be able to hold people accountable for meeting those missions. I think it's also important to judge the management of a prison by their reduction in violence towards inmates and the reduction in violence towards staff. So there's many measurements that you need to look at to make the prison safer, and then what we are doing for that offender to make the public safer by the programs that we bring into our prisons that make them successful on reentry.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions.
Yes, I'm Morgan Moss. I'm with the Center for Therapeutic Justice, and the director's already said that changing the culture of the institution and the culture of corrections tends to bring about lasting change. And I'm wondering, at San Quentin, the culture that you saw change there, is that beginning to show any effect on recidivism? The other thing is what you talked about with your visit in Watts. Changing the culture involves the community, and this is for the commissioner or the director or both, Changing that culture, I think, needs to, we call it an indigenous resource, involve the offenders and ex-offenders. And I wonder if you all are using successful ex-offenders on commissions, boards, because just as the director said she found in Watts, there's such a wealth of wisdom there. And also using the offenders and inmates inside a facility to positively change the culture inside.
Well, at our community outreach forums that we had ex-offenders that were in the room, a couple of which had gone through programs at San Quentin, and I was just really pleased to have them there. And at San Quentin, we have a Protestant chaplain who meets with a group of ex-offenders monthly to see how they're doing, and their numbers are growing, and we intend to meet more with them and learn from them what works, because we always study what doesn't work. We always talk about what doesn't work, but some of our offenders make it, and we haven't spent enough time talking to them to understand what did work for them. When I first became warden at San Quentin, which was 6 years ago, one of the first things I did is I went to Delancey Street, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Delancey Street, but it's just a wonderful program, and it is such a sense of community, and I know that the average offender at Delancey Street has 12 felony convictions. And I went to see Mimi Silvert, who runs the program, started the program, runs the program, and I said to her, give me some really good advice. And she said to me, you need to respect everybody that comes to the table. Everybody. You have to listen to what everybody has to say. You have to get to the hearts and minds of the correctional officers. You have to get to the hearts and minds of the offenders that you serve. And if you do that, you're going to be successful. So I took that advice, went back to San Quentin, and really started to work on getting to the hearts and minds of the correctional officers and the offenders that I served. And I think that using that approach, that's what changes the culture of a prison. And I don't know whether the programs that we used at San Quentin were working, because we didn't have the researchers to look at those, but we're bringing that kind of research in to begin studying the kinds of programs that were started around the state by different wardens. What works and what doesn't work. In my heart, I think they're working. Okay.
I'm Reg McKean of the Harvard Institute for Learning and Retirement. And of course, the question I'd like to ask is, when will my backward home state of Massachusetts start to catch up with California in this area? Unfortunately, the state legislators are not here. So a couple of other very short questions. Recidivism rates between the two states that you represent would be interesting. And okay, Commissioner Dennehy, let's take the 3-year span that you recommend. Are such statistics available comparing the two states? Perhaps Professor Peel might want to try this one if neither of the other panelists do. And my other question is specifically to Commissioner Dennehy. I think the Globe yesterday had an editorial blasting Massachusetts corrections or prisons for poor quality treatment of prisoners in terms of their health care, or was it some other journal I read that in? I'd appreciate your comments.
Actually, I'm struggling to remember the editorial yesterday, and that I'm up every morning and I read 3 papers at 4:30, and I'm wondering if it was about an article that ran about a study that was released at UMass regarding the care of female offenders, specifically as it related to family reunification. That's the only one I can.
Maybe you could respond to the first question, since that was more clear, about whether there's any evidence on recidivism across the two states that could inform this discussion.
Ours averages about 42 to 47% in 3 years. Said another way, Massachusetts recidivism rate for the state prison system, not for the counties, is that high. I'm not sure what California's is.
And unfortunately, ours is one of the highest in the nation. And that is absolutely why we need to change the way we do business within our correctional facilities. I mean, when the governor came in, that's what he said. I mean, this is a $1 billion failure, or several $1 billion failure. And that's why we're going through the reforms that we have, because up until Governor Schwarzenegger came into office a year or so ago, we were about punishment all of our programs left our prisons unless you were a warden who was able to beg and borrow and get volunteers to come in and try to help you do some kind of programs. So we're returning to doing that. In terms of healthcare, I need to tell you that healthcare across the nation in correctional facilities is a tremendous problem. The lack of being able to get quality healthcare providers to come into the prison system, I think is probably a problem in every state that I know of. So we're all struggling with that issue. We're all trying new and innovative ways of trying to address healthcare in just every state facility that I know of. Your experience may be different.
Say in Massachusetts, we privatized healthcare back in 1990-91, and several private companies had been involved in the delivery of healthcare, specifically the medical, the mental health, as well as the dental. The last contract was awarded to the state's medical school, to UMass Medical. And UMass Medical partners and provides all of those services. They do use some subcontracts, but for the most part, it's UMass Medical that provides the services.
And in California, we've just begun discussing with the UC system helping us provide healthcare services. We have such a shortage of nursing staff in the state of California that's just a tremendous problem.
Okay, last question.
Thank you. My name is Robin Kasari, and I'm director of a project called the National Emotional Literacy Project for Prisoners. And first of all, I want to applaud both of you. It's so hopeful to see two women that are trying to really make an effort to change the culture of prison. So thank you. My question is around overclassification in the use of supermax and the use of maximum security prisons for so many inmates that simply don't need to be there, and certainly don't need to be there for the amounts of time they're there and the profoundly destructive nature of that experience. And I'd like to know from both of you, are you taking some real serious action? Obviously, you have a million things on your plate, but I think that the destructive nature of this insane system of supermax really obviously needs to be addressed. And what are you doing to address this issue?
Want me to try that first? Well, in the state of California, fortunately, we've had the help of the federal court system for a number of years, so it is changing as a result of the involvement of the federal court system. Pelican Bay, probably the most famous supermax in the state. I had the opportunity to visit about 6 months ago, and I had visited it when it first opened. What a big difference. When you see offenders in groups with group therapy going on and real interaction and people communicating, it's just a big difference. We have a long way to go, though. In the state of California, the idea was if you misbehaved in the prison setting, you went away to these supermaxes, and you weren't going to be provided any kind of program. Well, as part of our prison reform, we're looking at how we address gang issues. We're looking at what we should be doing. I mean, those are the very people we need to be doing something with, because they're paroling right out of those supermaxes, and they're going back to our communities and creating more victims, and that's just not good public policy. So we actually have brought in some experts to come and help us design what should be going on in each of the missions that I've talked about, beginning with what should our gang strategy be? What should we do with offenders when they are in these supermaxes? We're looking at expanding our use of the Correctional Learning Network as a way of bringing treatment, or not treatment, but education into the individuals in the supermaxes. Some of the concepts of taking TVs away from these offenders, it just doesn't make sense. We need to bring those TVs back, but use them in an appropriate way to bring information to them. We have so much work to do that our initiatives, we're in the process of outlining how we're going to roll them out, but I believe that will take us anywhere from 3 to 5 years to bring these new programs into place.
Commissioner, you want the last word on classification?
In Massachusetts, for the past almost 2 years, we've been working with the National Institute of Corrections. Their consultants have been helping us to do the technical statistical work to develop an objective point-based classification system for males and also for females. We wanted it to be as gender-specific and distinctive as possible. The consultant is due to come back to Massachusetts April 20th with the final draft. We have already piloted the program. We are getting ready to roll it out. we anticipate that it is going to result in addressing the very issue you identified, overclassifying. We certainly know that we overclassify women in this state. We suspect, anecdotally, that we overclassify the men. We have more data around the women. So my sense is you're going to start to see within a 6-month cycle starting in April some movement. But it's, you know, it's fascinating. They tell you in any major management book, the things that you place on your agenda are the things that get done. Absent rolling out a new process, just the talking about a new process, we have 3 empty cell blocks at Cedar Junction. We have 3 empty cell blocks at our maximum security prison for men because staff have picked up those cues just in the preliminary education effort and have started to appropriately step offenders down as they move through the sort of custody levels. And that's without even formally introducing the new instrument.
That's great.
So.
And I also want to applaud the fact that even when people are at that high class level, you can do something really constructive with them. So what are we doing with them when they are? Giving them televisions with educational and, you know, supportive programming to help them deal with some of the issues and problems that they're dealing with and so on and so forth. So I hope it's not just a classification issue, but really looking at how we can deal with this in the most humane and productive and helpful way for the whole society.
I would say our biggest challenge, Robin, is going to be, it's going to take us a year to classify everyone in the department using that new instrument. At the same time, we are trying to do a really honest, open inventory of what our programs are. At the same time, assessing our physical plants so that we get to the point where we have a real sense. If you think of it as physical plants have security levels, once we assess the custody levels of the inmates, what is that appropriate match of beds to inmates? And it's going to call us to do some redesigning of the agency within the next year or so.
Thank you very much.
All right, I want you to join me in thanking our guests for sharing their experiences and their wisdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ann. Pleasure to be here. It was painless, Ann. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you. Thank you. You had a question?